If you've ever ordered a dish of oysters around Puget Sound in Washington State, you've most likely been face to shell with the Pacific oyster. If you were lucky, you might have even met the Olympic oyster. Both of these special shellfish are more than just a yummy treat stuffed inside a natural treasure chest. These animals have a long history in the United States as hardworking environmental stewards of our coastal waters and strong economic providers. One of the only fjords in the United States, Hood Canal, is home to a flourishing community of oysters. Tucked inside Washington's Olympic Peninsula, Hood Canal is the ideal place to find the intertidal beach oyster, the most popular of them being the Pacific oyster and Olympic oyster. Oysters gather in large beds due to their peculiar life cycle, and they provide important environmental health that benefit not only the marine biology in their direct environment, but the environment of the region as a whole. These animals are beginning to struggle as pollution starts to take a toll on the ocean's health and ecosystems. How will our changing environment affect oysters' lifespans? Will this in turn further affect our world and our livelihoods? Oysters are bivalve mollusks found in oceans all over the world. Bivalves are sea animals that have a long, flat body and are made up of a shell consisting of two hinged body parts. Imagine a pocket mirror that opens up, or the lid of a cookie tin that hinges on one side. Oysters are also filter feeders. This means that in order to eat, they're constantly taking in water in search for small organic matter, such as plankton. Oysters can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day in search for food. After filtering the water, they release it, leaving the water clearer and cleaner than before. Due to oysters' filtering techniques, they eliminate toxins in the water, decrease algal blooms, and absorb nutrients from the land that flows into the water. If the water they are living in is too polluted, oysters can in turn be poisonous for human consumption. Let's talk about oysters' reproductive and life cycles. Some oysters have two sexes, but all oysters have egg and sperm used in reproduction. When the warm spring air rolls onto the Olympic Peninsula, the temperature in bays, inlets, and fjords rises. Mature oysters that live in these areas are signaled to spawn. They release their eggs into the water, and the reproduction process happens. Eggs are fertilized within the water column. Within 24 to 48 hours after fertilization, an egg forms into what is called a trosophore. This trosophore is a small, swimming oyster larva. As this larva continues growing, it forms into a D shape and continues to swim freely in the water. This is known as the D stage. After about 20 days in the D stage, the trosophore forms a black spot and a small foot that helps it to latch onto things. This is called the veliger, or the eyed phase. Once the organism attaches to a hard object, which is usually a rock or an adult oyster, it is known as a spat. After the spat connects to an oyster or rock or other various hard objects, the spat then stays connected until it reaches adulthood. This can take up to 6 months. Oysters eventually reach mature and full size around 2 years old. Typically, around 2 or 3 is the best time for harvesting. Because spats form on hard objects, oysters are usually found in large groups known as reefs or beds. These oyster beds provide marine environments and habitats for other animals, such as shrimp, crabs, and many other types of shellfish. These oyster beds were once found in abundance throughout the Pacific Northwest. The Olympic oyster, the oysters native to Washington's coast, was harvested sustainably by the native people for thousands of years. Upon Western colonization and the Californian gold rush, larger harvesting operations began affecting the oyster's population. Around the 1800s to the early 1900s, a large demand for oysters quickly depleted the population, and due to the slow reproduction rate of the Olympic oysters, the best solution was to look overseas. Oysters from the east coast of the United States were imported with little success. But when the Pacific oysters from Japan were imported, they had no problem replenishing the oyster population. Today, the Pacific oyster continues to provide for the region, yet the Olympic oyster is making its comeback through the help of the nature preservation societies. While the Olympic oyster's population is rising, oysters all over the world are facing danger. In the age of mass harvesting and mass production, oysters are being strongly affected. The most common commercial harvesting technique is known as dredging. Dredging is when a large rake is dragged along the ocean or the bay floor. Oyster beds and other organisms that lay at the bottom of the ocean are swept into a large basket, then sorted by size and collected. Dredging can be extremely harmful to the environment and to animals in the area due to degradation of habitat, intrusive noise, and increased suspended sediment, which affects water quality and animals' feeding habits. Oyster farms are also popular. These have a less negative impact on the environment of the region. Usually, oyster farms include floating beds that hold oyster populations. These can have a positive impact on bays as they allow for the wild population to replenish itself while still supplying demand and filtering the bay water. While oysters are threatened by overharvesting, their biggest threat, along with many other marine animals, is the acidification of the oceans. Increased levels of carbon dioxide in the air changes the pH of the ocean, creating a more acidic environment in which these animals cannot survive. When carbonate levels in the water are too low, oysters and other shellfish cannot build up their protective shells in an effective way, shortening their lifespans, causing harm ultimately to the entire ecosystem. Water in the open ocean has a pH of around 8.1. Scientists estimate that the pH of surface ocean water has dropped by 30% since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Due to heavy harvesting, damaged and destroyed habitat, disease, and other human factors, more than 85% of oyster reefs around the world are gone. How will these dramatic changes in our environment further affect our ecosystems around the world? Here in Hood Canal, oysters are everything. Washington State produces more cultivated oysters than any other state in the U.S. They help the economy and the environment for many regions on the eastern and western coasts. Oysters provide habitats, they provide clean water, and they provide profit. These magnificent mollusks are important for our earth in all its aspects. Support sustainable oyster farming operations. And remember that if oyster populations begin to decline more intensely, our oceans could take a dark turn for the worst.